February 7th, 2023. Millbrook, Michigan, a small industrial suburb 20 miles northwest of Detroit. The abandoned Consolidated Motor Works plant had stood empty for 36 years, its broken windows and crumbling brick walls a monument to American manufacturing's decline. Urban explorers who ventured inside that cold morning would make a discovery that would resurrect one of Detroit's most infamous unsolved mysteries. The massive factory floor stretched nearly the length of 3 football fields, filled with rusted machinery and collapsed sections of roof that had created small mountains of debris over decades of neglect. The building had been scheduled for demolition to make way for new development, prompting a final wave of urban exploration before the structure disappeared forever. Jake Morrison and his girlfriend Sarah had been documenting abandoned buildings throughout Michigan for their photography blog. They'd entered the plant through a gap in the perimeter fence around 9 a.m., cameras ready to capture the haunting beauty of industrial decay. The morning light streaming through broken windows created dramatic shadows across twisted metal and collapsed concrete. Around 10:30 a.m., while exploring the factory's far corner, Sarah noticed something unusual beneath a section of collapsed roof. Metal glinted beneath layers of dust and debris in a way that seemed wrong for factory equipment. She called Jake over, and together they began, carefully clearing away broken concrete and twisted steel beams. What emerged from beneath the rubble made them both freeze. It was unmistakably an automobile, a massive luxury sedan from the 1950s or 60s, barely visible under decades of dust, and the collapsed structure that had concealed it. Through the car's shattered windows, they could see something that made Sarah immediately call 911. A human skeleton sitting behind the steering wheel. Detective Sarah Chen of the Michigan State Police arrived at the scene around noon, followed quickly by forensic specialists from multiple agencies. The vehicle was a 1959 Chrysler Imperial in midnight blue, its distinctive styling still recognizable despite severe corrosion and the weight of debris that had hidden it for decades. The collapsed roof section had fallen across the car in a way that had made it nearly invisible unless someone stood directly beside it. But it was what forensic specialists found inside the Imperial that would shock law enforcement across Michigan and beyond. On the skeletal left hand, still circling finger bones, was a distinctive gold signet ring bearing the initials VM, carved in elaborate script. Detective Chen had seen that ring in countless police photographs from the late 1950s. It had always adorned the hand of Vincent "Vinny the Voice" Marcelli, Detroit's most notorious mob boss, who had vanished without trace on December 15, 1959. 64 years. Vincent Marcelli had been missing for 64 years, one of Detroit's greatest unsolved mysteries. And he'd been here the entire time, in his beloved Chrysler Imperial, hidden beneath collapsed factory roof, waiting for urban explorers to finally reveal his resting place. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened on December 15, 1959, involves organized crime at its peak in Detroit, family secrets, and a disappearance that devastated a wife and 2 children who never stopped wondering what happened to their father. By the end, you'll understand how Vincent Marcelli ended up dead in his car in an abandoned factory, and why it took 64 years to find him. The questions facing investigators were both haunting and complex. How did one of Detroit's most powerful criminals die in his own car in an abandoned building? Was it murder, suicide, or something else? And could a 64-year-old mystery possibly be solved when nearly everyone involved was dead? Vincent Michael Marcelli was 38 years old in December 1959 at the absolute height of his power in Detroit's underworld. He stood 5 feet 8 inches tall with a compact muscular build that he maintained through regular exercise and careful attention to his health. His jet-black hair was always immaculately groomed and slicked back in the style of the era, and his gray-green eyes had a quality that people never forgot: sharp, penetrating, capable of conveying both warmth and menace depending on the situation. Vincent dressed like the successful businessman he appeared to be, favoring custom-tailored dark suits from the finest Italian clothiers in Detroit, crisp white shirts with gold cufflinks, silk ties, and polished leather shoes that cost more than most men earned in a month. His signature piece was that gold signet ring with his initials, a gift from his father when Vincent had purchased his first legitimate business. He wore a gold Rolex watch and always carried several $1,000s cash in a money clip, because in his world, cash was respect, and respect was survival. But beneath the expensive clothes and the charismatic smile was a man living a complicated double life that few people truly understood. To his wife, Maria, and their children, he was a devoted father and loving husband who ran successful restaurants and a construction company. To Detroit's underworld, he was one of the most powerful and dangerous men in the city, controlling gambling, labor racketeering, and various criminal enterprises that generated enormous profits. Vincent had been born Vincenzo Marcelli in September 1921 to Italian immigrants Giuseppe and Rosa Marcelli in Detroit's East Side. His father had operated a small grocery store on Gratiot Avenue, working 16-hour days to provide for his family while maintaining the old world, values that had shaped his character. The store had been more than a business. It had been a gathering place where the neighborhood's Italian families had shared news from home, discussed local politics, and supported each other through difficult times. Young Vincent had grown up in a 2-story brick house, squeezed between similar homes in a working-class neighborhood that pulsed with immigrant life. Summer evenings had been filled with Italian conversations drifting from open windows, the aromas of garlic and tomato sauce marking dinner time, children playing in narrow alleyways, while mothers called them home in voices carrying the musical cadences of the old country. Giuseppe Marcelli had been a man of quiet dignity who'd insisted his children master English while honoring their Italian heritage. He'd spoken broken English with customers, but had been determined that his son would have every advantage America could offer. What Giuseppe hadn't understood was that his son's sharp intelligence and natural charisma would lead Vincent down a path that would have broken his father's heart. Vincent had shown remarkable intelligence from an early age, excelling in school while simultaneously learning the unwritten rules that governed street life in his neighborhood. By 13, he was already serving as a liaison between older criminals and younger associates, his ability to communicate and negotiate making him valuable to various factions competing for control of illegal activities. His mother, Rosa, had recognized her son's exceptional qualities while fearing the dangerous paths they might lead him to explore. She'd encouraged his academic achievements, harboring dreams that he might become a lawyer or doctor. She'd died in 1943, never learning the full extent of her son's involvement in organized crime, though Vincent suspected she'd known more than she'd admitted. Vincent's rise through Detroit's underworld had been meteoric. Starting as a numbers runner at 16, he'd quickly distinguished himself through reliability, discretion, and innovative approaches to traditional criminal enterprises. Unlike many contemporaries who'd relied primarily on intimidation and violence, Vincent had possessed an instinctive understanding of human psychology that allowed him to resolve conflicts through negotiation and compromise when possible, violence only when necessary. By 25, he'd controlled significant gambling operations on Detroit's East Side. His success had been built on treating both customers and employees with respect, ensuring gambling debts were collected fairly, and winners received full payouts promptly. This reputation for honest dealing, ironic for a criminal, had attracted customers from throughout the metropolitan area, including wealthy professionals who'd valued discretion. What had truly set Vincent apart from other criminals was his understanding that successful illegal enterprises required the same attention to detail as legitimate businesses. He'd maintained meticulous records, kept careful accounts, invested profits wisely in both legal and illegal ventures. His business philosophy emphasized long-term stability over short-term gains, distinguishing him from more impulsive criminals who'd often destroyed themselves through reckless expansion or unnecessary violence. In 1946, at age 25, Vincent had married Maria Constanzo in an elaborate ceremony at St. Anthony's Cathedral. Maria had been 22, strikingly beautiful with dark hair and expressive brown eyes, the daughter of a successful importer who'd maintained business relationships with figures whose activities occasionally ventured into legally questionable territory. She'd understood from the beginning the complexities of marrying Vincent Marcelli. Maria had brought grace, intelligence, and social connections that enhanced Vincent's standing in both legitimate and criminal circles. She'd managed their household with quiet efficiency while helping Vincent navigate the social obligations that came with his growing wealth and influence. Their home was an imposing three-story brick mansion in Detroit's exclusive Boston Edison district, featuring imported marble floors, hand-carved woodwork, and crystal chandeliers that created an atmosphere of old-world elegance. Their first child, Vincent Jr., had been born in January 1947, a son who from his earliest years had shown signs of inheriting his father's intelligence and charisma. The boy had his father's dark hair and sharp eyes, and Vincent had been fiercely proud of him, determined that his son would have every advantage while hopefully never needing to enter the criminal world that had made the family's wealth possible. Their daughter, Angela, had been born in March 1949, 2 years younger than her brother. She had her mother's beauty and a gentle nature that both parents had treasured. Vincent had been especially protective of Angela, wanting her to grow up innocent of the darker aspects of his business dealings. By 1959, Vincent Jr. was 12 years old, and Angela was 10. Both children attended private Catholic schools and had no idea their father was anything other than a successful, legitimate businessman. Vincent had been determined to keep it that way. He'd built strict walls between his criminal activities and his family life, never discussing business at home, never allowing associates to visit the mansion, never giving his children any reason to suspect the truth. Vincent's legitimate businesses had included 3 successful restaurants, a construction company, and a trucking firm. The restaurants had been his particular pride, authentic Italian establishments featuring cuisine prepared by chefs he'd recruited from New York and Chicago. The flagship location, Marcelli's on Jefferson Avenue, had attracted politicians, business leaders, and celebrities who'd appreciated both the excellent food and the discreet atmosphere. But it was his criminal enterprises that had generated the real wealth. By 1959, Vincent controlled significant gambling operations, labor racketeering activities involving several key unions, and loan sharking that provided financing for various legitimate and illegitimate ventures throughout Detroit. His organization employed dozens of people directly and influenced hundreds more through fear, respect, and carefully distributed bribes. Vincent had been known in the underworld for his strategic thinking and ability to resolve disputes through negotiation rather than violence, though he hadn't hesitated to use force when diplomacy failed. His most trusted lieutenant, Anthony "Tony the Tiger" Rossini had managed gambling operations with ruthless efficiency. His cousin Carlo Marcelli had overseen labor racketeering, using a combination of economic incentives and carefully calibrated threats to achieve favorable agreements with union leadership. What made Vincent particularly effective was his careful cultivation of his public image. He'd been a generous contributor to Catholic charities, a patron of Italian cultural organizations, a regular attendee at civic functions. His annual Christmas parties for underprivileged children had attracted positive newspaper coverage. To much of Detroit, Vincent Marcelli had been a successful businessman and community benefactor, not a criminal, controlling illegal enterprises worth millions of dollars. But by late 1959, Vincent had been facing increasing pressure from multiple directions. Federal investigators had been examining his activities. Rival criminal groups from Chicago, led by an ambitious operator named Samuel "Sam the Snake" Benedetto, had been attempting to expand into Detroit territory. Internal tensions within Vincent's own organization had been growing as the operation became larger and more complex. Those close to Vincent during the fall of 1959 had noticed he'd seemed increasingly tense. Maria had observed her husband spending more time in his study, taking more phone calls at odd hours, occasionally making cryptic comments about business problems that he wouldn't discuss in detail. She'd learned early in their marriage not to ask too many questions about his business, but she'd sensed something was different this time, something that worried him more than usual: challenges. Vincent had tried to shield his family from his concerns. At home, he'd remained the loving father and devoted husband, attending Vincent Jr.'s school events, helping Angela with her homework, maintaining the facade of normalcy that had been so important to him. But Maria had known him too well to be completely fooled. Something was happening, something serious, and Vincent wasn't telling her what it was. December 15th, 1959, would be the last day Vincent Marcelli spent with his family, the last day his children would see their father, the beginning of a mystery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Tuesday, December 15th, 1959. Detroit had awakened to temperatures just below freezing, with light snow beginning to dust the city streets by mid-morning. The weather forecast called for several inches of accumulation by evening, prompting many residents to complete errands early before road conditions deteriorated. Vincent had risen at his usual time of 6:30 a.m., following the precise routine that had governed his mornings for years. 20 minutes of exercise in the basement gymnasium he'd installed, followed by a hot shower and meticulous attention to his grooming. By 7:15, he'd been dressed in one of his custom dark suits, ready to face whatever the day would bring. Maria had prepared his customary breakfast in their elegant dining room: espresso, fresh fruit, toast with imported Italian jam. The children had already eaten and been driven to school by Maria's cousin, who helped with family errands. Vincent and Maria had sat together in comfortable silence, a routine they'd shared for 13 years of marriage. "The children's Christmas pageant is this Friday," Maria had reminded him, pouring more espresso into his cup. "Angela has been practicing her solo all week. She's so nervous about it." Vincent had smiled, his expression softening the way it always did when discussing his daughter. "I wouldn't miss it for anything. Tell her I'll be in the front row." "Vincent Jr. wants to know if you'll help him with his science project this weekend," Maria had continued. "Something about electricity and batteries. He says his teacher thinks he could win the school competition." "Of course," Vincent had replied. "Saturday afternoon, we'll work on it together. The boy's brilliant, takes after his mother." Maria had smiled at the compliment, though her eyes had held a hint of concern. "You've been preoccupied lately." Is everything all right with the restaurants? Vincent had reached across the table to squeeze her hand. Everything's fine, cara mia. Just the usual year-end business complications. Nothing to worry about. It had been a lie, but a loving one. Vincent had never discussed his real business with Maria, and she'd never pressed him for details he wasn't willing to share. It was an unspoken agreement that had sustained their marriage. She would accept what he told her and not ask questions that might force him to lie more elaborately. At 8 a.m., Vincent had met with his accountant Benjamin Goldstein in his study to review financial records for his legitimate businesses. Goldstein had reported excellent profits for 1959, with the restaurants performing particularly well and the construction company winning several lucrative contracts. Vincent had been pleased but distracted, his mind clearly on other matters that had nothing to do with legitimate business accounts. Around 9:30, Vincent had driven his 1959 Chrysler Imperial, his pride and joy, purchased just 11 months earlier, to his office above Marcelli's restaurant on Jefferson Avenue. The Imperial was a magnificent vehicle, midnight blue with cream leather interior, equipped with every available luxury option. Vincent had loved that car, the way it announced his success to everyone who saw him driving through Detroit. The drive through downtown had taken him past construction sites and busy streets filled with Christmas shoppers. Vincent had taken pride in Detroit's prosperity, recognizing that the city's economic success had provided the foundation for his own achievements, both legitimate and criminal. His office above the restaurant had served as headquarters for his legitimate businesses, a spacious room furnished with expensive mahogany furniture and decorated with photographs showing him with civic leaders and prominent citizens. From here, he'd conducted meetings with restaurant managers, construction foremen, and the lawyers and accountants who'd helped maintain the complex web of businesses that had provided cover for his criminal activities. The morning had brought routine appointments: the manager of his newest restaurant, labor representatives from his trucking company's union, his lawyer regarding a civil lawsuit. Normal business, nothing that had seemed unusual or threatening. Vincent had handled each meeting with his characteristic attention to detail and personal charm, giving no indication that anything troubled him. At noon, Vincent had hosted lunch in the restaurant's private dining room for 3 Chicago businessmen considering investing in a downtown Detroit construction project. The men had represented what Vincent's world called legitimate interests with connections, businessmen who maintained relationships with organized crime while operating primarily legal enterprises. The lunch had lasted 2 hours, filled with discussions of construction costs, zoning regulations, and potential profits, all conducted with the discretion that characterized Vincent's business dealings. Around 2:30 p.m., Vincent had made a phone call from his office, a call that restaurant employees later reported seemed to agitate him. One secretary had heard him say, "I understand," several times, in a tone that suggested he didn't like what he was hearing. After hanging up, Vincent had sat quietly in his office for nearly 30 minutes, unusual for a man who typically remained in constant motion. At 3 p.m., his cousin Carlo had arrived for their weekly meeting to discuss labor contracts and union relationships. Carlo had later told police that Vincent had seemed distracted during their conversation, repeatedly checking his watch and ending the meeting earlier than usual. When Carlo had asked if something was wrong, Vincent had assured him everything was fine, but had mentioned he had an important meeting later that evening that he needed to prepare for. At 5 p.m., Vincent had called home to speak with Maria. The conversation had been normal, affectionate. He'd asked about the children, reminded Maria about Angela's pageant on Friday, promised to bring home her favorite pastries from the restaurant. He'd told her he had a business dinner that evening and would be home around 11. It was a common occurrence, nothing that had alarmed Maria. What Maria hadn't known was that Vincent had lied about the dinner. There had been no scheduled business dinner. Whatever meeting Vincent had planned for that evening, he'd kept it secret, even from his closest associates. Around 6 p.m., Vincent had left his office and driven to his barber for a trim and shave, another weekly routine. The barber, who'd served Vincent for over 10 years, had later reported that his customer had seemed nervous, chatting less than usual and repeatedly checking his watch. Vincent had tipped generously, as always, and left around 7 p.m. From 7 p.m. until around 9:45 p.m., Vincent's whereabouts had been unknown. His Imperial had been seen by several witnesses driving through various Detroit neighborhoods, but no one had been able to confirm where he'd gone or whom he'd met. This 2.5-hour gap in his timeline had frustrated investigators for decades, representing crucial hours that might have explained what happened next. At 9:45 p.m., Vincent had appeared at Marcelli's restaurant, surprising the evening manager who hadn't expected him. Vincent had seemed agitated, pacing in his office and making several brief phone calls. One employee had overheard him say into the phone, "I'll be there at 11. This ends tonight, one way or another." At 10:20 p.m., Vincent had left the restaurant for the final time. Several employees had watched him walk to his Imperial in the parking lot, get in, start the engine, and drive away into the light snow that had been falling more heavily as the evening progressed. No one who saw him leave had noticed anything unusual about his behavior or any indication that he was afraid or concerned about danger. That was the last confirmed sighting of Vinny the Voice Marcelli. He'd driven away into the December night and had simply vanished, as completely as if he'd never existed. When Vincent didn't return home by midnight, Maria had been concerned, but not yet alarmed. His business sometimes required him to work late, or attend meetings that ran longer than expected. But when 2 a.m. arrived with no word from her husband, and no answer when she'd called his restaurant office, real fear had begun to set in. By dawn on Wednesday, December 16th, with Vincent still missing and his Imperial nowhere to be found, Maria had called her husband's cousin Carlo in tears. Carlo had immediately begun making calls to Vincent's associates, trying to determine where Vincent might have gone after leaving the restaurant. No one had seen him. No one had heard from him. By noon Wednesday, Carlo had reluctantly called the Detroit Police Department to report Vincent missing. The police had been initially reluctant to investigate aggressively. Vincent Marcelli was a known criminal, and men in his line of work sometimes disappeared for various reasons. But Carlo had insisted something was wrong, that Vincent would never stay away from his family this long without contact. Detective Lieutenant Robert Morrison had been assigned to lead the investigation. Morrison had been a tall, lean man with graying hair and penetrating blue eyes, with 23 years of experience and a reputation for thoroughness. He'd understood immediately that Vincent's disappearance represented something more significant than a simple missing person case. This was one of Detroit's most powerful criminals vanishing without explanation, which could trigger a violent struggle for control of his organization. The initial investigation had focused on locations where Vincent might have been taken against his will. Police had searched abandoned buildings, empty lots, remote areas throughout southeastern Michigan. Divers had explored sections of the Detroit River where bodies had been discovered in previous cases. Despite intensive efforts that had continued for weeks, no trace of Vincent or his Imperial had been found. Morrison had assembled a task force that had included detectives from multiple precincts and FBI agents. The Me Too group had worked with unprecedented cooperation, recognizing the case's importance. Their investigation had encompassed financial records, phone logs, surveillance reports, and informant testimony. Thousands of man-hours had been devoted to finding Vincent Marcelli. The search of Vincent's home had revealed a man who'd lived a carefully compartmentalized existence. His personal study had contained an extensive library and photographs documenting his involvement in civic and charitable activities. The safe in his office had held detailed records of his legitimate business activities, along with cryptic coded notes that investigators had assumed related to his criminal enterprises. The codes had never been broken despite extensive efforts. Interviews with family members had been heartbreaking. Maria had been genuinely devastated, insisting her husband would never abandon his family voluntarily. She'd been unable to provide any useful information about where Vincent might have gone, as he'd never discussed his business activities with her in detail. Vincent Jr., 12 years old, had been confused and frightened. He'd worshipped his father and couldn't understand why he hadn't come home. "Did I do something wrong?" the boy had asked Detective Morrison with tears in his eyes. "Is that why Daddy left?" Morrison had knelt down to the boy's level, his voice gentle. "Your father didn't leave because of anything you did, son. Your father loves you very much. We're going to do everything we can to find him." 10-year-old Angela had been even more distraught, crying constantly and refusing to sleep in her own bed, insisting on staying with her mother. "When is Daddy coming home?" she'd asked repeatedly. "He promised to watch my Christmas pageant." He promised. The children's grief had haunted Morrison throughout the investigation. Whatever Vincent had been involved in, his children were innocent victims who deserved to know what had happened to their father. More productive had been interviews with Vincent's criminal associates, though these conversations had required careful navigation. Anthony Rossini, Vincent's lieutenant, had reported increasing tensions with Chicago criminals attempting to expand into Detroit territory, particularly Samuel Benedetto, an ambitious operator who'd been making aggressive moves into areas Vincent controlled. According to Rossini, Benedetto had been approaching lower-level members of Vincent's organization, offering better arrangements in exchange for switching loyalties. Vincent had been preparing to confront this challenge, though Rossini claimed he didn't know the specific details of Vincent's plans. The investigation had also uncovered evidence of internal disputes within Vincent's organization, disagreements about expansion plans, profit-sharing arrangements, appropriate levels of violence. These internal conflicts had provided possible motives for someone within the organization to eliminate Vincent. Federal investigators had been particularly interested in Vincent's connections to organized crime families in other cities. His alliances with groups in Chicago, Cleveland, and New York had required constant maintenance and negotiation, creating situations where misunderstandings or perceived slights could have had serious consequences. Despite these extensive efforts, the investigation had produced more questions than answers. No physical evidence had been discovered. No witnesses had come forward with credible accounts of Vincent's abduction or murder, and no demands for ransom had been received. The absence of evidence had been as puzzling as any clues might have been. As weeks had turned to months, the investigation had gradually been scaled back, though never officially closed. Detective Morrison had continued working on the case even after his retirement years later, maintaining hope that someday the mystery would be solved. The years following Vincent's disappearance had brought dramatic changes to Detroit's criminal landscape. Anthony Rossini had attempted to maintain control of gambling operations, but had been found dead in his apartment 6 months later, the victim of what police had determined was a professional assassination. Carlo Marcelli had proven more successful in maintaining labor racketeering activities, but had never achieved his cousin's level of influence. The fragmentation of Vincent's empire had created chaos that had lasted for years, with various factions competing for control through violence and intimidation. The stability Vincent had maintained through careful diplomacy had been replaced by chaos that had made Detroit's underworld far more dangerous for everyone involved. Maria had faced enormous challenges maintaining the businesses Vincent had built. Several restaurants had been forced to close within a few years, while others had struggled without Vincent's personal involvement and connections. The family had maintained a comfortable lifestyle, but had gradually withdrawn from the social prominence they'd enjoyed during Vincent's lifetime. In 1966, 7 years after Vincent's disappearance, Maria had petitioned the court to have her husband declared legally dead. The declaration had allowed her to settle his affairs and access resources needed to raise their children. But it hadn't provided answers about what had actually happened to the man she'd loved and lost. Maria had never remarried, maintaining her identity as Vincent's wife until her death in 2008 at age 84, 49 years after her husband's disappearance. She'd taken her questions and grief with her, dying without ever learning what had happened on that December night in 1959. The 64 years between Vincent's disappearance in December 1959 and the discovery of his remains in February 2023 saw Detroit transform dramatically. The prosperous, manufacturing city of Vincent's era had declined through the latter half of the 20th century, with factories closing, population declining, and entire neighborhoods abandoned. Vincent Jr. had grown up knowing his father had been involved in criminal activities, though the full extent had only become clear as he'd gotten older. He'd chosen to pursue a legitimate career, eventually becoming a successful corporate attorney while carefully avoiding any connections to organized crime. He'd married, raised children, built a normal middle-class life far removed from his father's world. The younger Vincent's decision to reject his father's criminal legacy had been both courageous and painful. He'd spent his entire life wondering what had happened, creating theories, dismissing theories, never finding peace with the not knowing. "I'd rather know he was murdered than wonder forever if he chose to abandon us," he'd once told a therapist. Angela had left Detroit after college, settling in California, where she'd become a teacher and raised her own family. She'd rarely spoken about her father's disappearance, preferring to remember him as the loving parent who'd attended her school plays and helped with homework, rather than the criminal figure described in police reports. She'd created a life as far from Detroit and its painful memories as possible. Both children had maintained hope, in different ways, that someday they'd learn the truth. Vincent Jr. had periodically contacted police, asking if there were any new developments. Angela had created a small altar in her home with her father's photograph, lighting candles and praying for his soul, though she'd abandoned most other religious practices. Neither had expected that, after more than 6 decades, answers would finally come. The Consolidated Motor Works plant, where Vincent's body had lain hidden, had operated until 1987, employing thousands during Detroit's industrial heyday. After its closure, the building had stood abandoned for 36 years, slowly deteriorating as weather, vandalism, and neglect took their toll. Multiple sections of roof had collapsed over the decades, including the section that had concealed Vincent's Imperial. The search for Vincent had continued sporadically for decades, with new theories and potential leads emerging periodically. In 1975, skeletal remains discovered during warehouse demolition had raised hopes, but forensic examination had determined they belonged to someone much younger. In 1983, a fisherman had found what appeared to be expensive clothing in the Detroit River, but no definitive connection to Vincent could be established. In 2006, a dying man had confessed to participating in Vincent's murder, providing details that hadn't been made public. But further investigation had revealed the confessor had been incarcerated in federal prison the night of Vincent's disappearance, making his confession impossible. The false confession had been particularly frustrating because of the genuine hope it had generated. The development of new forensic techniques had periodically renewed hope. DNA analysis had been performed on several items recovered from Vincent's office and automobiles, though no useful results had been obtained due to the age and condition of samples. Advanced computer analysis had been applied to coded documents found in Vincent's safe, successfully deciphering several entries but providing no clues about his fate. February 7, 2023. Jake Morrison and Sarah Chen, no relation to Detective Sarah Chen of the Michigan State Police, had been urban explorers documenting abandoned buildings throughout Michigan. They'd entered the Consolidated Motor Works plant around 9 a.m., cameras ready to capture the dramatic decay before the scheduled demolition. The building's interior had been a photographer's dream. Dramatic light, streaming through broken windows, rusted machinery creating abstract sculptures, nature reclaiming industrial space through vines and small trees growing through cracks in concrete. Jake and Sarah had spent over an hour exploring and photographing before venturing into the factory's far corner. Sarah had been the one to notice the unusual metallic glint beneath collapsed roof debris. "Jake, come look at this. There's something under here that doesn't look like factory equipment." Together, they'd begun carefully moving broken concrete and twisted steel beams. What had emerged had made them both freeze in shock. The distinctive shape of a 1950s luxury sedan, barely visible under decades of accumulation. Sarah had shined her phone's flashlight through the shattered driver's side window. What she'd seen had made her gasp and step back quickly. "Jake, there's someone in there. There's a skeleton in the driver's seat." Jake had immediately called 911 while Sarah had taken photographs, her hands shaking slightly as she documented what they'd found. The car was enormous, clearly an expensive luxury vehicle from its size and styling. Despite severe corrosion and the debris covering it, the vehicle's basic form was recognizable. This was a Chrysler Imperial from the late 1950s. Detective Sarah Chen of the Michigan State Police had arrived around noon, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air as she'd approached the scene. She'd been a cold case specialist for 8 years, with particular interest in unsolved disappearances from Detroit's criminal past. When she'd seen the Imperial and the distinctive gold signet ring on the skeletal hand, her heart had begun racing. "Call the forensics team immediately," she'd ordered her partner, Detective Marcus Williams, "and find me every file we have on Vincent Marcelli. I think we just found Detroit's most famous missing mob boss." The forensic examination had begun immediately, with specialists documenting every detail before disturbing anything. The collapsed roof section had created a nearly perfect hiding place, concealing the Imperial from view unless someone stood directly beside it. The section had fallen decades earlier. Forensic analysis of the debris patterns and rust suggested sometime in the 1980s or 90s, creating natural camouflage that had kept the car hidden even during previous searches of the building. The Imperial itself had been severely corroded after 64 years, its once magnificent midnight blue paint reduced to mottled rust and oxidation. The chrome bumpers and trim were pitted and tarnished beyond recognition. The leather interior had deteriorated to fragments, leaving only corroded metal seat frames. The tires had rotted away completely. But it was the condition and position of the skeletal remains that had told the most important part of the story. The skeleton sat in the driver's seat in a normal, relaxed position, suggesting the person had been sitting normally when death occurred. The skull was intact, showing no signs of bullet holes or fractures that might indicate violent death. The skeleton was complete and articulated, indicating the body hadn't been moved or disturbed since death. The gold signet ring on the left hand's fourth finger was the first crucial piece of identification. Vincent's distinctive ring with the initials VM in elaborate script. On the left wrist, still circling the bones, despite severe corrosion, was a gold Rolex watch frozen at 11:47. In the area where the inside jacket pocket would have been, investigators found the deteriorated remains of a leather wallet. The wallet had nearly completely decomposed, but within its remains were items that had partially survived. A driver's license, its plastic severely yellowed and brittle, but still partially intact, showed a photograph faded by time but still recognizable, and a name, Vincent Michael Marcelli. Also present were fragments of paper currency, too deteriorated to determine exact denominations, and several business cards reduced to illegible scraps. Scattered across what remained of the driver's seat area were metal objects that had outlasted organic materials. Buttons from the suit jacket, a corroded money clip, cufflinks, and a small religious medallion commonly worn by Italian Catholics of Vincent's generation. The Imperial's odometer showed it had been driven approximately 47 miles from the time. It had left the restaurant on December 15th, a distance consistent with a trip from downtown Detroit to the Millbrook factory and possibly other locations along the way. This suggested Vincent had driven somewhere else before arriving at his final destination. Most significantly, forensic examination of the Imperial's exhaust system revealed modifications that appeared inconsistent with factory specifications. The exhaust pipes had been altered in a way that would have directed exhaust gases, including deadly carbon monoxide, into the passenger compartment more efficiently than would occur naturally. The modifications were subtle but deliberate, showing sophisticated knowledge of automotive systems. The forensics team had carefully documented the car's interior before disturbing anything. The windows had been closed when the section of roof had collapsed, and the fallen debris had created something approaching a sealed environment. This had both preserved evidence and provided crucial context for understanding what had happened. The absence of keys in the ignition suggested either that Vincent had been killed elsewhere and placed in the car, or that someone had taken the keys after his death. However, the natural position of the skeleton argued strongly that Vincent had been sitting normally in the driver's seat when he'd died, not placed there after death. Detective Chen had stood looking at the Imperial for a long time after the initial examination, trying to imagine what had happened on that December night 64 years earlier. Vincent Marcelli had driven here voluntarily. That much seemed clear from the position of the remains. But why? To meet someone? To hide? And how had he ended up dead with modified exhaust systems that suggested premeditated murder? The identification of the remains had been confirmed through multiple methods. Dental records, maintained in archives for over 6 decades, had provided definitive identification. The skeletal structure matched Vincent's known physical characteristics: height, build, evidence of healed fractures documented in his medical records. Most poignantly, DNA comparison between bone samples and genetic material provided by Vincent Jr. confirmed familial relationship consistent with parent and child. After 64 years, there was no doubt. The skeleton in the Imperial was Vincent "Vinny the Voice" Marcelli. The forensic determination of cause of death had been based on context rather than direct physical evidence. After 64 years, soft tissue that might have shown physiological signs of carbon monoxide poisoning had long since decomposed. Chemical analysis of bone samples couldn't detect carbon monoxide, as the gas doesn't leave permanent traces in skeletal material the way some poisons might. However, Forensic specialists had been able to reach conclusions based on the totality of circumstances. The modified exhaust system that would have directed carbon monoxide into the passenger compartment. The closed windows. The enclosed space created by the collapsed roof section. The absence of trauma to the skeleton. All evidence pointed to one conclusion. Vincent Marcelli had died from carbon monoxide poisoning while sitting in his Imperial. The critical question was whether this had been murder, suicide, or accident. The modifications to the exhaust system strongly suggested murder. These changes had been deliberate and sophisticated, requiring automotive expertise and mechanical knowledge. It would have been extremely difficult for Vincent to have arranged these modifications himself without assistance from someone with specialized skills. The investigation had then focused on determining who had possessed the opportunity and expertise to modify the Imperial. Service records revealed that Vincent's car had been maintained by a prestigious Detroit dealership catering to wealthy customers. The Imperial had been serviced on December 10th, just 5 days before. Vincent's disappearance, for routine maintenance including oil change and tire rotation. Significantly, the vehicle had remained at the dealership overnight, providing opportunity for unauthorized modifications. The mechanic who'd performed the service had died decades earlier, but his former supervisor had still been alive and had been interviewed by detectives. According to this witness, the dealership had occasionally performed unauthorized work on vehicles belonging to customers involved in criminal activities. One mechanic in particular, Michael Torino, had been known to have connections to organized crime figures and had possessed the expertise to modify vehicle systems in ways that wouldn't be immediately detectable. Most tellingly, Torino had disappeared from Detroit in early January 1960, shortly after Vincent's vanishing, and had never been located despite police efforts. Further research had revealed that Torino had been employed by Samuel Benedetto, the Chicago's criminal who'd been attempting to expand operations into Detroit territory controlled by Vincent's organization. The connection between the mechanic and Benedetto had provided the final pieces of the puzzle. Benedetto had been frustrated by his inability to make inroads into Detroit's criminal market and had been considering aggressive methods of eliminating competition. Vincent's murder would have achieved multiple objectives, removing a powerful rival while creating chaos within his organization that could have been exploited by outside groups. The method chosen for the murder had been consistent with Benedetto's reputation for sophisticated crimes. Unlike shootings or beatings, carbon monoxide poisoning left little evidence and could be mistaken for suicide or accident. The decision to hide Vincent's body and vehicle had maximized disruption by creating uncertainty about his fate. More damaging to his organization than confirmation of his death would have been. Detective Chen had presented her findings to prosecutors, though the passage of 64 years had created significant challenges. Samuel Benedetto had died in 1978 while serving a federal prison sentence for unrelated charges. Michael Torino had never been found and was presumed dead. Most others potentially involved had also died, eliminating possibilities for prosecution. For Vincent's family, the discovery had brought closure after 64 years of painful uncertainty. Vincent, Jr., now 76 years old, had been contacted by police when the remains were identified. He'd flown to Detroit immediately, seeing his father's Imperial and the ring that had never left Vincent's finger in life or death. "I was 12 years old when he disappeared," Vincent Jr. had told Detective Chen, his voice breaking. "I've spent 64 years wondering if he abandoned us, if we'd done something to make him leave. Now I know he didn't choose to go. Someone took him from us." Angela, 74 and still living in California, had chosen not to view the remains but had expressed relief at finally having answers. "I can stop wondering now," she'd said in a phone conversation with her brother. "After all these years, we can finally let him rest." Vincent Marcelli's remains had been released to his family in April 2023. On April 28th, 63 years, 4 months and 13 days after his murder, Vincent was buried in a Detroit cemetery in Trapway, a plot near his father Giuseppe. The funeral had been private, attended only by close family members, Vincent Jr., Angela, their children and grandchildren, a few elderly relatives who'd known Vincent decades earlier. The gravestone erected for Vincent was simple. Vincent Michael Marcelli, 1921–1959, beloved husband and father, finally home. The Chrysler Imperial that had been Vincent's tomb was preserved as evidence and eventually donated to a law enforcement museum, where it stood as a testament to both the persistence of investigators and the ultimate futility of attempting to escape justice through violence. The case had provided valuable lessons about preserving evidence even when immediate solutions seemed unlikely. The skeletal remains and automotive evidence that had solved the mystery wouldn't have been available if earlier investigators hadn't maintained careful documentation and proper evidence storage procedures. The story of Vincent Marcelli's life and death had provided a window into an era when organized crime had played a significant role in major American cities. His murder had marked the end of an era in Detroit's criminal history, as the violence following his disappearance had ultimately led to increased law enforcement attention and the decline of traditional organized crime in the city. For Detective Sarah Chen, the case had become the defining achievement of her career, demonstrating how persistence and modern forensic techniques could finally provide answers to even the most challenging cold cases. Her work had provided hope for families of victims in other unsolved crimes, proving that some mysteries, no matter how old, could still be resolved. The 64 years that had passed between Vincent's murder and the discovery of his remains had witnessed dramatic changes in both criminal organizations and law enforcement techniques. Yet the fundamental dynamics had remained consistent: ambition, greed, and violence continuing to drive conflicts between those competing for illegal profits. Vincent's story illustrated both the temporary power that could be achieved through criminal activity and the ultimate vulnerability of those who chose to live outside the law. He'd built an empire, provided for his family, earned respect and fear in equal measure. But in the end, he'd died alone in his car in an abandoned factory, a victim of the same violence he'd used to build his success. The human cost of organized crime extended far beyond its direct victims. Maria Marcelli had spent 49 years not knowing what had happened to her husband. Vincent Jr. and Angela had spent most of their lives carrying the burden of their father's disappearance, wondering if they'd been abandoned, creating theories and dismissing theories, never finding peace with the not knowing. The hardest part wasn't that he was gone, Vincent Jr. had said during the funeral. It was not knowing why. Now we know. He didn't leave us. He was taken from us. That doesn't make it hurt less, but somehow it makes it hurt differently. We can finally grieve properly. As investigators closed the file on one of Detroit's most famous cold cases, the story stood as a reminder that no crime, regardless of how carefully planned or how much time had passed, could remain hidden forever. Modern forensic science, careful preservation of evidence, and the persistence of dedicated investigators had finally brought Vincent Marcelli home, providing his family with the answers they'd sought for more than 6 decades. The amber glow of streetlights had cast long shadows across the industrial sprawl of Millbrook, when urban explorers had first entered the abandoned factory that February morning. They'd been searching for photographic opportunities in ruins, but they'd found something far more significant. The final resting place of a man who'd been Detroit's most powerful criminal, a devoted father and husband, and ultimately a victim of the violence he'd helped perpetuate. Vincent "Vinny the Voice." Marcelli had finally been silenced, but his story would continue to serve as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the enduring pursuit of justice. After 64 years hidden in darkness, he'd been brought into the light, his mystery solved, his family given closure, his grave finally occupied. Rest in peace, Vincent Marcelli. Your long wait in that Imperial is over. Your children know what happened. You're home.